All right, good evening from Tokyo. This is the middle of Golden Week. Today actually wasn't a holiday, so I think we're allowed to have an exponential finance live session before we're then resting for 4 days, which is very nice. So welcome, Stephen Nagy, who's a professor at ICU here in Tokyo. Uh, Welcome, Stephen. Great to
Thanks
have you
very
here.
much. Thanks very much, Norbert.
And we made the topic your most recently edited volume, which is Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific construct. So we'll have a geopolitical discussion, more so than a finance discussion. But a few years ago, one would have said the world is really flat and you can do your business anywhere. You just need to optimize the supply chain. And clearly that world has changed. Where do you put the current epoch that we're in? How do you describe it compared to what has happened really since the 2000s?
That's a super question. And I think even though this is a finance podcast, I think that the machinations of geopolitics within the region and the efforts by some states, in particular authoritarian states, to fundamentally transform our international institutions so that they work better for authoritarian states and, quite frankly, much worse for democratic states, are all colliding to really affect finance flows, supply chains, how we think about security, and how we think about investment. And that technology, geopolitics, and the collision of authoritarian states and democratic states really is going to fracture our global economy. It will likely result in what I call globalization, and it will likely result in fractured finance pathways. And I think that this is going to be a challenging place for businesses that focus on finance.
So you're talking about the Indo-Pacific construct, and maybe we should start with the definition of what that is.
So the Indo-Pacific construct really came out of the brainchild of the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He gave a speech at the Indian Parliament back in 2005, and he talked about the confluence of two seas. And what he was talking about is that because the center of the global economy now is really located between the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, that we needed to create this construct that helps us frame the global direction of the global economy, but also challenges. So within this Indo-Pacific region that stretches from the east coast of Africa, really all the way to North America and down to South America, includes Australia, India, of course, Southeast Asia. This is where the biggest number of consumers are emerging. This is where middle classes are emerging. This is where resources are going to be. This is where new technologies are going to develop. And this is where conflict is likely to emerge. Conflict associated with kinetics, but also what we call non-traditional security issues such as climate change, transnational diseases, piracy, etc. The challenge with this Indo-Pacific region that we're thinking about is that it really has a paucity of institutions. And let me illustrate. Europe and the EU has many institutions. It has the European Parliament, it has, of course, strong governments, it has the European Commission, and this all creates a lattice work of institutions that stabilize the region's economy and allows it to deal with challenges such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or financial crises in Greece and Italy, or even dealing with things like the COVID crisis. But the region that we live in, this Indo-Pacific, doesn't have shared institutions, which means how we solve problems is really challenging. Countries like Japan, Canada, Germany, the United States, Australia, India, the ASEAN countries are all thinking about how they can slowly build institutions in the region so that they can deal with these challenges, stabilize the region, but also create the conditions for further economic synergies and prosperity.
And so the Southeast Asian nations that are at the center of the book obviously are also very diverse. And so they get squeezed. What does it mean? Is there a common theme that evolves across these Southeast Asian nations? Where do you place them?
You correctly identified this concept or this idea that Southeast Asian countries feel squeezed. And there's an expression in the region, if two elephants are fighting in the grass, the mice get squashed. And Southeast Asian states feel like mice. So they've built a construct, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to work together to create some balance. So it's a big economic area. It has about 600 million people, about $1 trillion of trade across the border with China. The United States is a huge investor there. But don't forget, the EU and Japan are also huge investors in Southeast Asia, not to mention South Korea and Taiwan. In fact, Taiwan is the third largest investor in Southeast Asia. So when we're thinking about Southeast Asia, they really want to ensure that they can continue to trade with China, they continue to trade with the United States, enjoy the security benefits that come with a relationship with the United States, and try to avoid being trampled by the two elephants in the room. And this is their long-term strategy, and it's built around this idea of creating strategic autonomy. So they can make choices that are autonomous of the pressures they may face from the US-China strategic rivalry.
Now, I've grown up in a bipolar world before the Berlin Wall came down. And how realistic is it what you described? There are the two elephants dancing. And do you really have a choice, or do you, in the end, need to pick a side that you're on?
Ultimately, I think that the countries in public understand that they can't take a side. So you hear repeated statements by prime ministers of Singapore, prime ministers and presidents of the Philippines or of Vietnam, etc., saying that they don't want to choose between the United States and China, and they would like these two countries to find ways to communicate and build more cooperation in the region. There's more concern about this relationship, and in particular, what's happening in China in terms of its economic slowdown and some of the challenges in terms of governance associated with Xi Jinping's change in general governance patterns. But there's also concerns about what's happening in the United States with its political divisions. And each of these candidates have, frankly, opportunities and challenges for Southeast Asian countries. They really don't want to choose, but I think privately and survey after survey demonstrates that they lean towards the United States, because even though it has become a little bit more unpredictable in the past 10 years or so, it still is a rule of law country, has strong institutions, it has the most resources in the region, and it gives them the ability to balance the size of China. And none of the countries in Southeast Asia really want to move in the direction that China has done in the past 10 years in terms of strengthening state control, in terms of a more illiberal domestic environment. They want to maintain their freedoms and autonomy. One is to tilt towards the United States, and two is to pull in strong extra-regional partners. And those extra-regional partners include Japan, they include the EU, they include South Korea, they include Australia. And they use those relationships, they use those trade and economic relationships to bring more balance into the region. And that's the way they're going to continue to pursue their autonomy and deal with the current, I think it's a bipolar world or a bipolar region, without a doubt. But that's how they're going to continue to try and negotiate this very challenging relationship.
So you mentioned Xi, and clearly the hottest topic around what could happen with China now that Hong Kong in one way or another is settled is the Taiwan question. Taiwan, but on the other hand, why the Southeast Asia book now? What drove you to that topic to publish on Southeast Asia now, which maybe is the topic after Taiwan, if we take a worst case scenario?
So Taiwan is a critical issue within the region, no doubt. But Southeast Asia, this region or ASEAN, it is the connector between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. The major sea lines of communication that ferry about 5.5 trillion US dollars of trade every year. I want you to put that into perspective. That's bigger than the German economy is ferried every year through the South China Sea, the Malacca Straits, in and around the East China Sea, around Taiwan, into Japan, South Korea, and China. So they really represent this kind of focal point of instability, potential friction that needs to have a focus, that needs to have a concerted diplomatic focus. And if this region is not stable, if this region accidentally or intentionally cascades into friction, it's not only going to have regional consequences, it's going to have global consequences. And this is why I think my co-editor, Dr. Indu Saxena, and I have decided to focus on Southeast Asia as this critical part of the Indo-Pacific construct. Taiwan's critical as well, but our view is that the Taiwan issue from the Chinese side is not an issue that they want to settle through violence or through military action. All five leaders in the post-Civil War period in China have said the same thing, that we want peaceful reunification with Taiwan and that we don't renounce the use of force. We see think tanks in China releasing papers that speak to the policymaking community in China that taking Taiwan by force will not make China richer, will not accelerate the road to the China dream in 2049. So there's a clear recognition that forcing the Taiwan issue is not in China's interest. My co-author and I really felt that the Southeast Asian part of the Indo-Pacific equation is really important because it links the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It's a place where if there is a problem, that it will cause global economic problems, and that we need to better understand how this region connects the Indian part and the Pacific part of this Indo-Pacific construct.
As you mentioned, the supply chain and the shipping lanes, it's clear that we see some friendshoring of the supply chains as well. So production being taken out of China, and that doesn't necessarily move back exclusively to the US or Europe, but it goes into more of Taiwan, Malaysia, maybe India even. There's some even chips factories being built. And of course, Japan gets all the alternative sites for chip factories as well. So the importance of Southeast Asia over the next 5 years, put on top what you mentioned in terms of the growing middle class anyway, is only going to increase.
Absolutely. And you started our discussion talking about how there's a lot of heterogeneity in Southeast Asia. And I think that's really an important point to draw out in this discussion. The growth in economy, the selective diversification of supply chains through Southeast Asia is going to be selective. And what I mean, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, maybe Malaysia are better suited for supply chains moving into those regions. So they'll benefit. And they'll benefit from, one, I think Japan and Korea and other countries investing a lot into those regions. And again, this speaks to your financial side of this podcast, is that these are going to be places that receive a lot of FDI, foreign direct investment. They're going to receive a lot of ODA, overseas development assistance. And we're going to see new markets open up, and new markets for investment, but investment not only into these regions, but we'll see a growing number of investors coming out from these regions. So I think it's a region to watch. I think it's also important to think that it's not only the Japanese and the Australians and Americans and Canadians that are relocating some of their supply chains there. It's also the Chinese. The Chinese are leaving because the domestic environment is becoming less conducive to making money. And of course, under Xi Jinping, the Marxist-Leninist tilt is making business in China less attractive. So I want to borrow a friend of mine's phrase, Carlo Dade from the Canada West Foundation. He says, you may want to run away from China, but you know what? You're going to run right back into China. And I think that Japan, South Korea, all these other countries that are diversifying some of their supply chains to South Korea, guess what? Or to Southeast Asia, guess what? Some of their suppliers and partners are Chinese. And this is going to continue to be the case. So as we're thinking about this through the lens of finance, I think that we need to get a better understanding of not only how Japan and South Korea and these countries are moving to Southeast Asia to try and deleverage from the Chinese market, but also Chinese businesses. Not only the discontinuity in supply chains, but also the continuity in supply chains is something to focus on as we think about the Southeast Asia becoming a much more important part of the region.
It's a very interesting point around private companies leaving China and reshoring somewhere else. But on the public side for China, we have, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative that's been also probably, we're now like over a decade into it, right?
Yeah,
Where
we're just
where do you see that?
useful to first, we're sitting in Tokyo. Let's think about Japan and its reputation in the 1960s in Southeast Asia. It was bad, quite frankly. They were seen as a rapacious country that went to Southeast Asia, took the resources and brought them back to Japan to make houses and bridges and etc. in the fast growth period of Japan. They received lots of criticism. There was anti-Japanese protests, whether it was Singapore or Malaysia or Jakarta or other parts of the region. The Japanese learned, and the Japanese now are the gold standard in terms of development and finance issues within the region. The initial 10 years of the Belt Road Initiative was a learning experience. They flexed their muscles, they put money out, they tried to find out what worked, what didn't work, and they're going to continue to go through a learning phase, and they're likely to become greener, meaner, and more sustainable in a smaller geographic area. So I think that the days of the Belt Road Initiative going to Western Africa and the Antarctic and the Arctic are over. The economic slowdown and likely long-term stagnation of the Chinese economy is going to require the BRI to be much more focused. And I guess the key words for your listeners is greener, meaner, and more regionally focused.
Got it. There's an audience question here. Let me just read this off. What do you think the main purpose of Xi Jinping's trip to Europe is, and why did he choose France over countries like Hungary and Serbia? Can Europe and the US economically influence China to reduce its support for Russia in the war against Ukraine? And what are the consequences for the EU and the US themselves?
Yeah, that's a lot of questions. Fadir, thank you very much for the super questions. So Hungary and Serbia already have strong relations with Xi Jinping and China. I was just in Hungary actually last month, and there's not the anxieties that I think in Hungary that I think other countries have about China. That doesn't mean the governance challenges, the authoritarian challenges of China, but they see China as a very useful country to work with to push back against what they feel is over-assertive Brussels in the region. Now, why France? I think it's quite simple. China would like to pull apart the United States alliance system that does include France, that does include Germany. And by providing economic inducements to France, and just last week, Chancellor Scholz was in China as well, providing economic inducements to the Germans as well, it creates a division. How aligned will they be with the United States on issues related to China? And I'm going to quote some German colleagues I spoke to recently. They said it quite frankly. There's no division between the United States and Germany and France on Russia. On the Chinese question, there's a little bit more space. But when it comes to human rights, when it comes to Taiwan, when it comes to pushing back against authoritarianism, especially as China indirectly supports Russia's war machine and its war on Ukraine, that the Europeans need to be aligned with the Americans. In that sense, whatever Xi can do to weaken that alliance or pull it apart is the raison d'etre for Xi to visit France. On the last question, can Europe and the US economically influence China to reduce its support for Russia? At this stage, I don't think so. And I encourage you to think about this from the Chinese standpoint. They look at Russia and they look at the war on Ukraine through the lens of instability. They know Mr. Putin. Xi Jinping has met Mr. Putin over 40 times. They have a shared worldview. They despise, I think, US influence in international institutions and financial institutions. And they want to break that down. The Chinese also understand that if Mr. Putin loses this war, or he suddenly disappears, that the next leader in Moscow is going to be more nationalistic, maybe more prone to war, or Russia could split up into different sections, a little bit like we saw in the post-Soviet period. And this means instability. It means economic instability. It means energy instability. it also potentially means that this fractured post-Putin Russia could have nukes throughout the region that aren't controlled in the way they are now. So China's priority actually is to try and end this conflict as soon as possible. They would like Putin to stay in power because he's predictable, and they want to stabilize the global economy and their regional relations so they can get back to business, because their biggest concern is economic stability at home, trying to generate jobs for the youth. The youth unemployment's at 25% now, to try and get the real estate market going, and to try and find ways again to stabilize a stagnating economy.
Since we are on the Ukraine topic now, I think even if you look at some of the early speeches that Xi made when he came to power, he talked frequently about the decline of the US and the decline of the West. And it seems, if anything, the Ukraine war has pulled the West closer together. Do you think there is kind of something in China that sees it similarly in terms of is a recovery of the Western alliance that has been under pressure?
Norbert, I think this is a very good point. There was a lot of talk within China about the East is rising and the West is fading, and a real sense that China's ascent to global centrality was inevitable. Today, those speeches are few and far between. I think there's a real recognition that the United States diplomatic power, its ability to work with European countries to push back against Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, its ability to use the financial system to cut off Russia from global finance. These are all very strong demonstrations of the United States' comprehensive power. At the same time, we've seen the United States use its diplomatic power to improve relations between Japan, South Korea, and the United States based on the Camp David principles. Just last week, Prime Minister Kishida was in Washington and gave an address to Congress that signed 70 agreements to strengthen the US-Japan alliance. At the same time, Prime Minister Kishida, President Biden, and President Marcos from the Philippines signed something called the Maritime Cooperative Initiative to enhance their cooperation in the South China Sea. But importantly, and I think this is really important for us to think about, it's not just maritime security. They talked about emerging technology cooperation. They talked about logistics. There's a clear recognition that the United States and its diplomatic power has to be much more than just military power. And this is how the Biden administration has really engaged at the global level, not just with regards to Russia and Europe, but also in this region. And this continues to be the case. And I think that the Chinese have learned that the United States shouldn't be counted out, and that their alliance network, their ability to reshape the global economy, their independent energy, their independent food, the best in universities, and its ability to recreate itself through this kind of social destruction that we see every 5 or 10 years is something not to be underestimated. Nobody's talking about the killing of Muslims in India. Nobody's talking about the Rohingya in Myanmar anymore. And I'm using these examples because I think it demonstrates that what's happening in the United States is probably being driven partly by disinformation from our Russian and Chinese friends, perhaps our Iranian friends, and that this may not be indicative of a broader social dissatisfaction on many issues, rather something that's been inflated, that is something that we often see outside powers do with the United States because they can't actually compete with it directly because of its comprehensive power.
I mean, that's maybe lesser geopolitical follow-on to that, but also this whole wave of misinformation. And I think in Germany we had coming out like Chinese spies in the right-wing parties and so on. How is a democracy that by definition is or should be open, how can we defend ourselves effectively against these new ways of warfare, essentially?
This organizational warfare has been around for a long time. It's part of the playbook of Marxist-Leninist societies. They co-opt information, they enhance narratives, or they dilute narrative. But social media and the internet has given new momentum to these technologies to be highly disruptive. And we've seen it affect elections in Canada and Australia and other countries. We saw it, of course, in the United States with the files being leaked on the Hillary Clinton side back in 2016. So we're working on it. Now, there's countries that I think are on the forefront of these challenges and political entities such as Taiwan. Taiwan faces disinformation every day, thousands and maybe millions of attacks. So they're on the forefront of battling this with regards to China. And they're a partner to work with. South Korea faces similar challenges with its North Korean neighbor. That's one of the asymmetric advantages that North Korea has. So they're an important partner to work with. Canada, Australia, they've had to deal with disinformation being deployed into their societies to affect the ethnic Chinese communities there. And of course, the United States. So the question is how to manage this. And we usually break it down into terms of identifying disinformation, mitigating disinformation, and then responding to disinformation. And lastly, it's creating literacy or education campaigns in our societies so that we're better able to detect disinformation. That last part is hard, it's long term, it requires strong education, critical thinking skills. And for us, in my case, as a professor at a university, my job isn't to share my views. My job is to teach people how to think. I think it's really important that we build into our education systems these critical thinking skills and start to read widely, not just through the lens of a liberal paper or conservative paper, but actually reading both so that you're getting different perspectives. And by doing that, you start to acquire skills to detect disinformation. So in my writing for think tanks, I often advocate for a non-state level of university consortiums between South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Canada, Australia, the US, perhaps Germany, to work with those universities to develop those four pillars: identification, mitigation, responding, and then lastly, educational strategies that help build stronger, more robust societies that can detect and naturally understand that this is disinformation.
Got it. Very difficult problem to solve.
Sure
So
is.
you also had an op-ed in the Japan Times just today or the day before where you talked about minilaterals, and you mentioned Kishida's visit to the US and this pact that was signed together with the Philippines. Does that fall into this minilateral bucket? And what can we expect by having a whole portfolio of minilaterals, basically?
I think what we've seen, Norbert, is that multilateral institutions are not working. We're not able to deal with the Gaza-Israel conflict through the United Nations. One country or the other veto it. We saw the same with the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, with regards to the recognition or how the Russians tried to recognize eastern parts of Ukraine as part of Russia. We couldn't stop that from happening in the United Nations. There was a human rights report released at the end of August 2023 by the United Nations on the Uyghur human rights situation in China that again was not allowed to be discussed at the United Nations because of fracturing of the United Nations. It doesn't work. So the question is how do we find, what are ways to deal with problems? And this is why these minilateral relationships have emerged. So the one with the Philippines and the United States and Japan is meant to deal with some of the challenges in South China Sea and provide some deterrence against an assertive China within the South China Sea, but also provide those public goods to help build a more robust Philippines that's able to help itself. And that's really important. How can we help the Philippines help itself? And that's through infrastructure connectivity, development, helping with emerging technologies. These are the kinds of strategies that build long-term synergy in our economies and strength and sustainability in terms of being able to deal with local problems. There's other minilaterals, like I mentioned, the South Korea, Japan, US minilateral. That's mostly targeting on North Korea, how to deal with weapons proliferation. The quadrilateral security dialogue that you might have heard about between India, Japan, the United States, and Australia, this has multiple functions. Maritime security is one, but that's not so important. It's about providing public goods, infrastructure, connectivity, working on emerging technologies. And I think one of the biggest or most recent minilaterals that we're talking about is AUKUS, the Australian, UK, and US agreement to, one, share a nuclear powered submarine technology. That's pillar one. And pillar two is emerging technology cooperation. So AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity, hypersonic missiles. How do we cooperate in these areas? And that pillar two is likely to expand in terms of memberships. I foresee likely Japan, maybe Canada, maybe a few other countries will be able to contribute there, because emerging technologies are seen as the technologies that's going to shape our finance scape. It's going to shape our relationship between government and citizens. It's going to shape many aspects of our future over the coming years.
Now, the world order that we live, or the institutions that we live with, clearly have their origin post-World War II, and they've never really been adopted. So the United Nations still is a Security Council that has France and England on it, the UK on it. And so when we're talking about AUKUS, for me, and no offense to my English friends, but where we are in this world currently feels a bit of an overreach for a country like the UK to say we start sorting out the Asian order.
I think that's a really good point. But the minilateral concept is basically this idea of working with partners that you can actually achieve something with. And I think here, the Australians and the UK and the United States, because of their very close relationship within the Five Eyes partnership, because of long-term engagement in intellectual exchanges at the university level, it provides a platform for very deep cooperation in sensitive areas. The reason why Japan was not invited to AUKUS is quite simple. It has too many loopholes in terms of security and secrecies. And until that's patched up, it's not going to be a reliable partner for some of these very sensitive areas. The emerging technology side, I really encourage you to think about this, because whoever's the first mover in terms of vanguard AI or quantum computing or cybersecurity, hypersonics, will fundamentally shape our economies for the next 50, 100 years. And we're using technology right now that is based on the US's innovations in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. All the protocols for the internet, all the protocols for international finance that you're working on is been innovated in the United States, and it's locked in. It's very difficult to move away from that US-based system and still be part of the global economy and be profitable and be maneuverable. And what we see, or at least how I understand the investment in emerging technologies, is that these relatively democratic, relatively rules-based societies, they firmly believe in creating technologies that serve people, that don't serve government, that ensure that privacy is protected, that ensure that the AI systems that we use are not used for a combat and for military, or if they are, that they still have human regulations. And this is why I think the UK working with the US and working with Australia on pillar two is incredibly important. On pillar one, their impact in terms of providing deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is much smaller, but it's a start.
And I totally agree also with your point. You want partners who can actually do something. And I think that's been proven with the Iranian drone attack on Israel, where I think in the end, the US probably shot down most of the drones, but the UK also immediately said they would send another aircraft carrier or so, while the Germans just said, good luck, basically, right? And they don't have the hardware to get involved. And so I do understand the angle of, yes, you want to have partners who are actually capable of taking action.
Yeah, and I think this is why we see very regional focused minilaterals rather than these kind of globally focused minilaterals. You can't do everything everywhere. And the expression in Canada is you don't want to spread the peanut butter too thin. And if you're trying to do something everywhere, it's going to be really difficult to have any meaningful, sustainable engagement. But that being said, I think different countries have comparative advantages. And you brought up Germany. Germany's comparative advantage obviously is manufacturing. It has a very high tech industry. There is a really strong argument that it probably could form part of Pillar 2 of the AUKUS agreement. With some of the supply chain diversification strategies on semiconductors, I think there's a strong case to include the Germans in these semiconductor relocation initiatives. Each country has its comparative advantages, and I think that we don't have to all do the same thing. The trick is collectively, how does that collective cooperation add up to something sustainable and meaningful? And I think that is the way to go. One last thing on this is that I think Germany is probably better situated to be one of the major actors in dealing with Russia's assertive behavior in Europe. And I'm not talking about combat, I'm talking about using its economy, its economic resources to strengthen Europe, use its diplomatic resources to coordinate policy and diplomacy, to help some of the countries that have a different view about Russia, to help them get energy. How do we help them become more reliable partners? And I think that is where Germany might be better positioned rather than investing a lot of resources in the Indo-Pacific. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not investing some of their diplomatic resources in that region.
Cool. Let's get back to like Southeast Asia and like the ASEAN construct, for example. You took Europe as a sample of a role model, seeing well-developed institutions, and some might argue that they are maybe too developed and becoming too powerful.
Yeah.
But what is the path forward for ASEAN to become a little more integrated politically?
This is a challenge, and I think that ASEAN's track record over the past 30 or 40 years is that they have regular meetings and the leaders know each other and they're comfortable with each other's political systems. But they can't really find any way to deal with serious political challenges within the region. The civil war in Myanmar is still going on. The Rohingya crisis is a good example. Even a code of conduct in the South China Sea hasn't been able to be secured because ASEAN is vulnerable to being fractured from external. Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, in particular, have been influenced by Chinese money. Moving forward, where does ASEAN go? There's discussions about an ASEAN minus construct where if 5 of the ASEAN countries or 6 of the other ASEAN countries agree on something, they move forward. This may be an important area. There's some discussion behind closed doors of ejecting Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. I don't see this likely, but I think that discussion is there. As the Chinese economy slows, what happens to the Southeast Asian economies? Their biggest trading partner is China. Just last year, they had $1 trillion of bilateral trade. So what happens to China matters. They also have demographic problems. Vietnam's getting old. Thailand's getting old. Myanmar is a mess. Indonesia is young. Philippines is young, but they don't have enough good quality jobs. And this means that wages are suppressed and they're going to find it increasingly difficult to move into that middle class income state of economy, which really then creates the kind of high quality growth that we need for consumption, but also for moving really away from a sustainable economy to an economy that's actually growing. So there are a lot of challenges in this region, and I think that a linear growth model is probably not the best way to think about it.
From a Japan perspective, the financials, there's been some who've been playing in Southeast Asia for a very long time. So MUFG, for example, I think they started acquiring banks in Southeast Asia around 2012. Some of them probably later, but there is a bit of this consensus emerging that this is like becoming a second home market, I think is a term that's being used, which in theory sounds good, but as you say, the earnings power is still pretty slow. So it's still a longer term play, but it's not only the banks, it's the malls are on going into Vietnam quite big and so forth. So it feels like Japan, which has, of course, historically focused so much on the US. And I think if you had also, we're talking about the startup scene broadly in Japan, it was always a dream for many entrepreneurs to say, we crack the American market. I think that seems to be shifting. So is there something Japan can do even more of to build these bridges and be an accelerator for economic growth?
So Southeast Asia, in some ways, has in a sweet place. So the Japanese and the Chinese are competing for influence within the region, and they're both deploying FDI and ODA to try and build infrastructure. So they're getting an injection from many countries. South Korea, who's also involved in the game. And then we see United States and Australia and India working on some financing to help with infrastructure connectivity in the region. So Southeast Asia, if they play their cards right, they can get the investment from many countries and hopefully level up their economy. But leveling up their economy can't just be building infrastructure for foreign manufacturing that exports for the region and globally. They have to educate their citizens. They have to create the software that can start to work in the finance field, work in the engineering, create the indigenous economic growth and ideas and innovation that's going to speak to the people of the region. And at this stage, they're not there. And this is, I think, that probably a major weakness of that part of the world is that the software isn't being produced there. The money that's being made is either through manufacturing or through property, not through the kinds of processes that I think South Korea and Japan did in their development process. Japan makes stuff. South Korea makes stuff. They export sophisticated technologies and also culture. But we don't see that in Southeast Asia yet. And that speaks to the level of development. And when my friends go to Vietnam or Indonesia, or the Philippines, I always say, go out, walk on the streets, look at the average people, and see what kind of economic life they have. And a lot of it is still subsistence. It's not the big spender middle class society that I think we're accustomed to. And until these societies really start to build the software that will build the new computers or the new technologies or the new financial tools to make profit, I think that they'll be marginalized and they'll largely be takers of products rather than creators of products. We'll have to watch this. I think there's a lot of really interesting things to keep our eyes on.
Well, look at China at the time when private enterprise was still fashionable, which doesn't seem that long ago. But you had the Ant Financial and you got Tencent, who had huge portfolios and still have huge portfolios of investments in all of Asia, including South Korea, actually. And if she hadn't stopped the Ant Financial IPO, for example, and let them run free, if they had done their CBDC and actually made it, internationalized it, something that we talked about the yuan for, I don't know, since the WTO accession, I think, they could have dominated the financial system for the consumer at the very least, with Alipay, WhatsApp Pay, and all the derivatives thereof. And in a way, they blew it when they shut down private enterprise.
Yeah, I agree. My view is that I think that the Chinese government has made a bet. There's a lot of parallels to the Great Leap Forward, and that didn't end very well. But the philosophy in the Great Leap Forward is that the Chinese would invest resources and mass mobilize citizens to produce steel to overcome the British in, I think, 3 or 5 years. And I think what we're seeing now in the post-COVID economy is the Chinese government has made this kind of Great Leap Forward bet that they're going to invest a lot in the industries that they think are going to be really critical in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. EV vehicles, batteries, solar, many environmental products. They want to corner this. And by cornering it, I think they feel that they can be the global leader in these technologies. And because they can produce them so cheaply, that we will be forced to consume them. Now, I think that they have the resources. They've done a lot of great stuff here. You should watch this space. But I think they've made the bet that our choices will be shaped by prices and not politics. And I think that they bet wrong here. And a few weeks ago, we had a group of German politicians come in. I spoke to them about this, and they had great worries about the Chinese EV market and what does it mean for the German economy. And you're German, right?
Yeah.
German economy has a few signature industries, and one of them is the automobile industry. And I think it's unlikely that the Germans are willing to give up their automobile industry. They'll find every possible way to keep it. So I think as we think about the Chinese economy, and you mentioned finance, I think that we should think about this idea of industrial policy and picking winners and investing huge resources to create monopolies that will shape the behavior of countries' consumption in the coming 10, 20, 30 years. I think their bet is partly correct. But where it's flawed is I think that they don't understand that Germans or Canadians or Americans are going to be willing to pay more over the politics. And I think that this is probably going to be a challenge for them. And it could be not another great leap forward in terms of starvation of 40, 50, 60 million people, but it could have been a big investment that really was based on politics or price and not politics, which I don't think they've clearly understood.
Yeah, it's just like maybe 2 weeks ago, right, when Xiaomi, the phone company, came out with their EV, and it looked like a Porsche on the outside and a Tesla on the inside for a fraction, a third or so of the price of the Porsche. I don't know. That's a big difference. We'll see what the consumers decide.
I think, though, we've learned a little bit about how markets can be weaponized. The South
Totally.
Koreans have learned this, the Japanese have learned this, the Canadians have learned this, the Australians have learned this, the Taiwanese have learned this, our Lithuanian friends have learned this. It's just a matter of time before those beautiful French handbags may face the same kind of economic coercion, or those beautiful German vehicles and pens and wallets and luxury goods. If you're on the wrong side of the political fence, you're likely to be subject to economic coercion. And I think that this is something that like-minded countries like Germany, like Canada, like Japan are growingly aware of. And they are trying to build their industrial policies in a way that at least insulates them from this monopolization of markets, but also monopolization of resources.
Agreed. I think the flip side of that clearly is that the other side is learning too. And so when you weaponize the US dollar, the technology to create your own swift copy and build an alliance and an axis of evil between Russia, China, Iran, maybe Saudi Arabia to do the oil trade in a non-US dollar currency is also there. You started off also by saying we see this split in the economy, and so the other side is going to drive that forward as well.
So I think this is a great point, but I want to bring up the example of Hong Kong. Since the 2020 national security law was adopted, we see Hong Kong become a much less attractive place for financial services and financial interactions. Financial firms have basically created Hong Kong as a Chinese hub and moved much of the regional services and offices to Singapore because they want to protect their intellectual property. They want to protect their knowledge and their industries. And in fact, they bifurcated their systems to ensure that if there is a problem, or if the Chinese Communist Party uses some of the recently adopted national security law to demand data, that they're protected. And this shows that a system that doesn't have a predictable rule of law rapidly becomes unattractive to countries that are interested in short, mid, and long-term investment and protection of their investments. And at this stage, although I think that the Chinese are working very hard to diminish the dominance of the US dollar, the dominance of the US dollar is really based on this predictable rule of law system, strong institutions. We know if we invest our money there, it's protected. And until that happens, I'm unconvinced the Chinese market's going to be attractive. And let me just add to this. It's not just Germans and Canadians that are finding the market less and less attractive. It's the Chinese citizens themselves. Under Xi Jinping, about 7.7 trillion US dollars of capital outflows have occurred. That's the German and the Japanese economy put together. If the Chinese are not investing in the system, why would other countries invest in that system?
Yes, and I think we'd all like to take that money, right? And that's what I quite honestly haven't figured out yet, because when I talk to some venture capitalists, if they see Chinese investors on a cap table, they're not going to invest anymore. And so it blocks the opportunity and again weaponizes the currency, while in a way it shouldn't undermine your own democracy, but in a way you should welcome this outflow, right? Give us another 7 trillion and we can put it to good use. But it feels like that money is tainted, and the weaponized US dollar state we're in, if it turns into an international currency, it's just limited as to where it can flow.
I agree. I think it's really important for us to understand, and it goes back to this point I made about AUKUS. The technology we have, the institutions that we have, we want to ensure that the government and the citizens' privacy is dictated by rule of law. And I think financial systems as well need to be dictated by rule of law, not governments, whether it's a Republican government, a Canadian liberal government, or conservative government, or a Chinese government. And the problem within the Chinese system that I think is the Achilles heel in terms of internationalize the renminbi is we've seen case after case of the Chinese Communist Party actually influencing the choices of businesses. So they act in the interest of the government and not the business. And from my standpoint, if we're thinking about buying into that system, we also have to buy into the politics of China. And I'm not so sure that businesses around the world are interested in terms of buying into that system, because ultimately you're at the whim of the party. And see, I encourage your listeners to think about what happened in COVID. China went from 4,000 or 5,000 cases of COVID to none, to this narrative that they had no COVID, and then to an explosion of COVID. And then one day the leaders snapped their fingers and they said there's no more COVID crisis. And the Chinese people are not stupid. The Chinese people saw their grandmas and grandpas, their uncles and aunts and their kids getting really sick. Many died. They understand the volatility of this ad hoc system where people make decisions, not based on rule of law, not based on rule by law, but rule of man. The different man walks in the room, there's different rules. How does this create a stable financial institution that allows for short, mid, and long-term predictable investment? And I'm just unconvinced at this stage.
That's a wonderful closing comment, I think. Thank you, Stephen. I think we're probably not seeing another man walking into the room there anytime soon, but we'll see, right? These are the unpredictable predictions where you can say, what happens if whatever, Xi or Putin gets a heart attack, how does it change the world? And I think some people probably do scenario planning around this, but this is, as you described, it's like the Great Leap Forward, and it's the same type of leadership that's centered solely on the person, something that Deng Xiaoping tried to remediate, at least in the transition. But there's no transition. He's going to be in that seat as long as he wants to be.
He'll be in power for as long as he's alive. I think, on an optimistic note, that the party has a long track record of building China, moving people out of poverty, building infrastructure. Well, the first time I went to China in the early 90s, it's a completely different country today. This is because of the party's long-term vision for making China a wealthy, stable society. And I think whether she is there or not, that's not going to change. If he passes away tomorrow, the party will continue that long-term agenda of building a strong and modern China. The question is how open or liberal or free it will be. I think that they've made the calculation that today and for the foreseeable future, an iron grip is the best way to be stable and to prevent outside influences rather than a loosening of that grip. And again, this speaks to the point about an alternative currency, but the party will be with us as long as we're alive, and it will continue to drive growth and drive modernity. I guess what we should watch out for is how they shape their education systems. Is it becoming more nationalistic? And how will it affect the regions like this, our new book on Southeast Asia, the Indo-Pacific construct. And what happens in China will spill over all around the world. And I think it's really important for us to watch, not just in Southeast Asia, but your home country, Germany, Canada, and where we live in Japan today.
Absolutely. And I think it's very important to talk about this from objective perspective, right? As objective as we can be. And so appreciate your sharing your time with us and sharing your insights, because we need to have people be aware of this and focus on that and read the papers and read the book. And you publish enough papers, you edit the book, so there's enough material around for anybody who wants to dig deeper into these topics. But really appreciate you taking the time here in the middle of Golden Week, and thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Norbert, and I look forward to talking to you again.
You too. Thank you. Thank you all for joining, and wherever you are, I think we had a pretty international audience today. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your week, whether you have to work or not. Bye-bye.